There are stories the Imperium tells with pride, carved into marble walls and recited in 1,000 triumphal processions. And then there are the stories that bury so deeply beneath blood and scripture that even speaking them aloud feels like a heresy with weight enough to crack bone. This one belongs to the latter, an origin whispered not by poets or remembrancers, but by dying apothecaries and exiled scholars who swore they saw something behind the legend. Ask any loyal citizen how the Space Marines were born, and they will offer the official litany, forged by the Emperor's genius, shaped by gene seed, sculpted to be perfect warriors of mankind. But there is a silence beneath that tale, a hollow so vast that generations of truth have fallen through it without echo. Because when humanity was drowning in its darkest age, the Emperor did not simply build his angels. According to the oldest forbidden accounts, he took something from the galaxy that should never have been touched, something ancient, wounded, and already dying, and forced it into a shape that could serve him. And for reasons lost beneath millennia of war, he ensured no one would remember the price. If you want to walk the path between sanctioned glory and the shadowed truth the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to strangle out of existence, then stay with me. The truth does not roar, it bleeds. And tonight, we follow the trail to where the first angels of death were truly born. Before we go further into the dark, steady your footing. Stories like this tend to vanish, and the Imperium prefers it that way. If you want more journeys through the forgotten corners of 40K's history, lend strength to this channel by liking the video, sharing it with a fellow lore seeker, and subscribing so you don't lose your place in the archives. Now onward. The first time I realized the official story was wrong, I was standing beneath a monument that had outlived empires. The statue rose from the marble like a blade pointed at the heavens, the armored form of a perfect warrior rendered in cold stone, every line proclaiming loyalty, purity, strength. Children traced their fingers along the carved imperial aquila on his breastplate. Priests whispered praises to the Emperor's genius. Administratum adepts recited approved verses describing how the angels of death were crafted impeccable, unblemished, inevitable. And yet, even as the incense burned and the hymns reverberated against the vaulted ceiling, I felt something fracture in the narrative. A small thing. A missing piece I could not name. The statue's eyes, though carved lifelessly forward, seemed to avoid the truth carved beside them, a neat, rehearsed history so clean it felt almost hostile to reality. I had come to this archive chamber on Terra expecting the quiet comfort of imperial certainty. Instead, I found a sense of pressure beneath the silence, as though the stone itself was holding its breath. My assignment was simple: compile cross-reference data for a Scholem lecture on early Astartes development. Nothing forbidden. Nothing dangerous. Or so I believed. But as I moved past shelves leaning like old soldiers and data slates slumbering under layers of dust, I sensed the weight of something hidden in the margins. Whole sections of the catalog were sealed behind redacted sigils, not by Inquisition decree but by something older, almost ceremonial in its severity. It was the kind of censorship that doesn't scream secrecy, it whispers it. I activated the first data slate expecting dry administratum records, but the screen bloomed with errors, corrupted fragments, and half-erased lines. The text trembled between one version of history and another, as if unable to decide which reality to obey. Some passages described early genetic successes worthy of triumph. but woven between them were hints of failures so profound they didn't read like scientific missteps, they read like tragedy. Unnamed aspirants whose bodies twisted beyond recognition. Cohorts that vanished from census records as completely as if they had never existed. A phrase appeared again and again. Template instability 'cause unrecorded. A phrase that should not have appeared in the Emperor's perfect design. The archivist on duty noticed my hesitation as another corrupted file opened, revealing only 2 surviving words. They begged. Her expression tightened with the practiced calm of someone trained to pretend nothing alarming had been seen. She guided me toward another wing of the archive, a place she claimed held cleaner copies. But the gesture felt too smooth, too deliberate. The kind of kindness given not to help a scholar, but to steer them away from edges best left unpeered over. Curiosity whispered its treacherous encouragement, and I followed the trail instead of abandoning it, far from the monumental statue and its comforting lie. Deeper into the labyrinth where the air grew colder and the lamps flickered as if reluctant to stay awake. I found a generatorium alcove still humming fitfully. The hum was a thin sound, like the dying breathing of something mechanical. Inside were older records, true relics from the earliest days of the Great Crusade, some so ancient their surfaces had warped into brittle curves. These were not the curated histories presented to citizens. These had been left untouched because no one wanted to read them. I accessed one, expecting little more than dust and static. What emerged instead was a single recording visual feed damaged, audio warped, time-stamped so far back it predates most imperial institutions. The flickering image showed a dim chamber lined with empty stasis tubes. The glass was shattered inward, fluid dripping in slow beads that froze mid-air where the pict feed glitched. No warriors stood inside. Only the residue of something once alive clinging to the metal like frostbite. A voice, thin and ragged, whispered from the audio. Prototype Cohort 3, failure total. No survivors. Escalate to extreme measures. Extreme measures. A phrase never found in sanctioned accounts of the Emperor's masterpieces. As the recording ended, the silence in the archive grew heavier, stretching around me like a second skin. I found myself glancing back toward the main hall where the statue stood unmoved and unbothered, its perfect face carved to deny the possibility of imperfection. Yet here, in the forgotten dark, the truth had no such mask. Whoever recorded that message had tried to speak a warning. Someone else had worked just as hard to bury it. The pattern solidified in my mind with unsettling clarity. The official origin story had too much shine, too much certainty. Perfection rarely emerges without failure, yet the Imperium had stripped the failures away so thoroughly that even acknowledging their existence felt like trespass. The Space Marines were celebrated as humanity's greatest creation, but these early fragments suggested they were born from something far more precarious. Something the Emperor did not want remembered. And as I stood alone with flickering screens and unspoken ghosts, one question took shape with the quiet inevitability of a blade being drawn. What had he been trying to hide? I returned to the central archive the next morning with the sensation of carrying an invisible weight across my shoulders, a pressure that did not relent even beneath Terra's filtered daylight. The great halls were crowded again, administratum adepts whispering their endless liturgies, servo skulls drifting like pale insects, and custodial servitors scrubbing floors that had already been clean. To anyone else, it was the familiar rhythm of imperial bureaucracy. But after what I had uncovered in the alcove's forgotten dark, all of it felt staged, as if the entire archive were performing its own sanctified version of truth to drown out what lay beneath. Even the monumental statue seemed less heroic now, its cold eyes gazing past the living with calculated indifference, as though daring anyone to challenge the tale carved at its base. I approached the archivist with new questions. Though I offered them slowly, testing her reaction, inquiries about early gene template experiments, about prototype cohorts predating the legions, about discrepancies in the recorded timelines of the Emperor's breakthroughs. Her smile tightened with a tension that flickered across her features fast enough to be mistaken for breath. She insisted that all relevant materials were already compiled in the approved curricula, clean histories, polished accounts, the triumphal sequence every loyal Imperial citizen learned before they could even recite the Creed of Unity. But when I asked about the sealed wings, the redacted indices, the files archived without catalog numbers, the calm facade cracked. Not fully. Just enough to show the strain. Those records, she murmured, voice low enough to be lost beneath the hum of servitors, are restricted for reasons above any of our clearances. Best not to disturb them. They are out of alignment with official doctrine. Out of alignment. Spoken like someone describing a warped gear in a manufacturing assembly line, not fragments of truth excised from humanity's greatest myth. Her refusal only deepened the pull in my chest. That dangerous gravity of forbidden knowledge. I walked away before she could call for assistance, choosing instead to drift into the quieter reaches of the archive, where ancient air recyclers droned and the dust was thick enough to trace with a fingertip. Here the shelves leaned close together like conspirators, and the lumen strips flickered as if deciding whether to stay lit. It felt like entering a forgotten chapel where only the dead still prayed. I pulled another antique data slate from a cracked shelf, its casing brittle as old bone. When I activated it, the first page showed a medical report written in clipped clinical language. At first glance, it seemed almost mundane notes on tissue rejection rates, phenotypic instability, corrective surgeries performed on unnamed subjects. But as the details unfolded, the words sharpened into something perilous. These weren't simply failed attempts at warrior creation. They were accounts of bodies twisting into forms the surgeons had not anticipated, bones sprouting like barbs beneath the skin, neural pathways collapsing under stress they were never meant to endure. The subjects died quickly, but not quietly. Their last moments were recorded with phrases so stark they chilled the blood. Violent autonomic seizures, muscle growth exceeding skeletal tolerance, mind collapse preceding cardiac failure. At the bottom of the report was a note. All early prototypes classified under Operation Lumen 5 are to be sealed indefinitely. No public record permitted. Await directive. Operation Lumen 5. A name no Scholem text had ever spoken. My pulse quickened as I unearthed more fragments, audio logs laced with static. Images of half-assembled gene labs where the walls were stained with something the pict recorders refused to clarify. Transcripts of arguments between unidentified gene cultists and senior administrative officials. The disagreements always circled the same issue. The Emperor's instructions had changed rapidly, sometimes contradicting earlier directives. Timelines shifted. Expected results dissolved into silence. The urgency in those fragmented exchanges felt less like scientific determination and more like desperation, On one corrupted recording, a weary voice rasped, "He said we do not have time to start again." The template must hold, even if it breaks them. A pause crackled through the static before another voice, brittle and afraid, answered, "But the subject is destabilizing. If we continue, they'll—" The recording ended there, cut so abruptly it felt intentional. I leaned back, my breath shallow as the implications coiled tightly around my thoughts. The official story insists the Emperor's vision sprang forth perfect and whole, a work of unmatched precision unmarred by failure. Yet these scraps, these haunted remnants of experiments conducted in silence, told another story entirely. He had been racing against something. A deadline, a threat, a prophecy none of the records said. But the urgency was undeniable, pulsing through every fragmented file like a heartbeat. The archive lights dimmed slightly as a new procession of priests passed through, their chants echoing off the stone. Their voices carried comfort for those who believe the statues lie. But to me, their hymns felt like a veil stretched thin over a truth that refused to be buried any longer. I closed the last file, my hands trembling from more than just fatigue. Behind the sanitized histories and polished triumphs, behind the marble monuments and endless liturgies, the Emperor's greatest creation had not begun as a miracle. It had begun as a wound, and the Imperium had spent 10,000 years trying to cauterize the memory. As the Fav's archivist's gaze followed me once more from across the hall, stiff and watchful. I realized that my search had shifted from academic curiosity to something far more dangerous. I had stepped into a story that did not want to be found. A story the Imperium itself seemed determined to erase, yet I could not turn away. Not now. Not after glimpsing the cracks beneath the stone, because the question that had first whispered itself in the shadows now echoed with unmistakable force. If this was the lie carved in stone, what was the truth buried underneath? The descent into the gene forges began with a vibration I could feel through the solace of my boots, a deep and rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of some buried giant. Even on Terra, where every corridor is fortified with ceramite and sanctified steel, the lower levels carry memories that refuse to die. As the lift cage rattled downward, the air thickened with a metallic tang that tasted of rust. Old blood and incense burned long ago. No citizen ever wandered this deep, and even many ranking officials avoided these halls unless duty forced them to confront the remnants of humanity's earliest experiments. It felt less like entering a laboratory than trespassing into a tomb. The doors parted with a reluctant hiss, releasing a breath of cold air that clung to my skin like a shroud. The lumen strips were dim, some flickering weakly, others dead entirely. Shadows stretched into long, uneven lines across the floor, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. The silence was unsettling, not the peaceful kind found in chapels, but the heavy, watchful quiet of a place that had seen too much suffering to ever forget it. Rows of containment cylinders lined the chamber, each one clouded with residue that obscured whatever might once have floated inside. Some held nothing but coagulated fluid clinging to cracked glass. Others displayed faint silhouettes, biological remnants fused into the metal, as though the vessels had tried to swallow their occupants whole. I approached one cylinder cautiously, reaching out to wipe the glass with a gloved hand. Beneath the grime lay a smear of something like calcified tissue, pale and brittle. It flaked away at my touch, drifting into the air like ancient dust. The data terminal beside it flickered to life with inconsistent lumens. Its interface was an archaic pattern of runes rarely seen outside tech priest archives. I entered a cautious sequence of commands, and the screen responded with a catalog of early modification attempts, entries so old they predated the First Legion's full deployment. The reports described proto-implants, gene seed variations, and metabolic enhancements tested on human volunteers as well as others. That word appeared frequently in faded script. Without classification or clarification, others. The term had no place in the clean narratives of imperial history, and yet it surfaced again and again, like a stain no amount of rewriting could remove. Scrolling further, I found a detailed account of a tissue sample designated as Origin Fragment 7. The text was partly redacted, but the surviving lines stated that the sample was not of human derivation and exhibited resilience to warp-induced degradation. A note from a supervising janitor urged caution. If integrated improperly, subject physiology responds with catastrophic rejection. Recommend isolation until foundation modifications are stabilized. Another line, half erased, mentioned a traveler likely metaphorical, but unsettling nonetheless, a traveler whose remains should never have been disturbed. My pulse thudded in my ears as the pieces began to shift, forming a shape I did not yet dare name. The Emperor was a craftsman of unparalleled genius. This much was certain, but these logs suggested that his earliest gene-forging efforts involved more than perfected human biology. Something else had been woven into the process. Something alien, or at least alien adjacent, its nature obscured by millennia of secrecy and ritual. Whatever it was, the tech priests who handled it seemed perpetually on the edge of awe and terror, recording their attempts with the trembling reverence of acolytes handling a sacred relic. Another report caught my eye. It described a catastrophic incident involving the implantation of experimental organ prototypes into a dozen subjects. Only one survived the initial procedure, and even he succumbed shortly afterward. The surviving audio fragment from the event was warped with static, but the voice captured within it was unmistakably human, hoarse, panicked, and breaking. "It doesn't recognize them," the speaker whispered. "It's trying to reshape them, but they're too fragile. We're too fragile." Those words lingered like frost inside my skull. If the foundation for the later gene seed had not originated from humanity, then the earliest test subjects had not been molded, they had been consumed. Forced to adapt themselves around a template they were never meant to survive. No wonder the official histories erased this era with almost fanatical precision. There was nothing glorious about it, only failure, blood, and the desperate determination to continue. I moved deeper into the chamber, stepping over debris and fallen sacred seals that had once marked restricted zones. The floor bore scorch marks in looping patterns, suggesting explosive failures during implantation or gestation trials. A shattered stasis chamber lay crumpled against a wall, its glass fused into crystalline shards. The fluid that had once filled it had hardened into grotesque patterns resembling veins. Someone had tried to scrub them away at some point, but the stains persisted like scars. Beyond that point, the room widened into a surgical theater. The metal tables were still stained, the straps broken from either age or violent struggle. Above them hung a fractured lumen globe that cast a pale, ghostly radiance. The shadows of long-dead Medicaid personnel seemed to linger in the corners, their last moments etched into the walls through the marks left by frantic hands. A data slate rested on one of the tables, its casing split but functional enough to reveal a final message. Typed in shaking script. We cannot continue without greater modification. The donor essence is too strong. It resists containment. If the master insists on stability, we must alter ourselves further. Or find another way. Emperor preserve us. The message ended not with a signature, but with a smear of blood trailing across the screen. My throat tightened as I absorbed the implications. These people had not simply struggled to build superhuman warriors. They had wrestled with a force that refused to be tamed. Something powerful enough that even the Emperor, in all his brilliance, needed to work around it rather than destroy it. Something that left behind fragments the Mechanicus still whispered about in rituals. They no longer fully understood. The lift cage doors stood open at the far end of the chamber, beckoning like an exit from a nightmare. But as I turned toward it, the hum of the forges shifted, rising in pitch for a brief moment before settling again. It almost sounded like an exhalation, like the room itself had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to remember its nightmares. I stepped into the lift and began the ascent, carrying with me the bitter truth that the foundation of the Space Marines was not built on pure human ingenuity. It was constructed from borrowed flesh and desperate improvisation, shaped by hands that trembled even as they obeyed, and as Terra's upper levels drew near, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. If this was the beginning, what had the Emperor sacrificed to make the rest possible? The lift ascended with a steady groan, each passing level shedding another layer of the forge's cold breath, yet failing to ease the heaviness pressing against my chest. By the time the doors opened onto a higher gallery, the air felt almost too clean, too carefully filtered, as though the upper levels were terrified of admitting the contamination of truth that slept below. Here the walls gleamed with polished steel. Devotional inscriptions lined every archway, and the lighting was bright enough to bleach shadows into submission. But cleanliness does not erase memory, and the forge's ghostly residue clung to me like soot beneath the skin. Walked through a corridor lined with pick panels depicting the Emperor standing tall above rows of flawless astartes. Each warrior was sculpted with mythic symmetry, expression unreadable, armor unmarred by even a single moment of imperfection. These were the images children grew up believing, the Prophet King and his perfect sons. Yet after witnessing the twisted remnants in the gene forges, I could not look at these depictions without sensing the absence beneath their certainty. The pics celebrated what came after. They said nothing of what came first. I turned into a smaller archival chamber adjacent to the gallery, one reserved for Mechanicus personnel but poorly monitored, perhaps because few Imperial citizens ever bothered to enter. The air tasted faintly of machine oil and incense, the scent of reverence born from routine. A row of cogitators hummed dully against the far wall. I approached them with caution, unsure what I expected to find, only knowing that my search no longer felt like an academic pursuit. It had become a kind of devotion of its own, a pilgrimage through the half-remembered wounds of the Imperium. The cogitator interface unlocked with surprising ease. A small flicker of script rolled across the screen. Access level? Obsolete. That word alone was promising. Obsolete information was often forgotten information, and forgotten information was harder to sanitize. I searched for records connected to the early experiments, the donor essence, the prototype organs, the term others that recurred without explanation. After several failed queries, a single encrypted index opened like a reluctant eye. It contained anatomical diagrams drawn with a precision bordering on zealotry. The sketches showed proto-organ structures bearing resemblance to those used in modern astartes, but warped in ways that puzzled the mind. Additional neural branches extending like roots searching for soil. Bone plates forming defense mechanisms incompatible with human musculature. Vascular networks that looped and spiraled like labyrinths. Each diagram was accompanied by annotations from a genitor, whose tone shifted between awe and dread. One line stood out: integration success, minimal. Essence resists reduction. We attempt to shape it, but it seeks to shape the host. Must consider full system reorientation rather than local augmentation. I leaned closer, my breath fogging slightly against the screen. Full system reorientation. They had not been adding enhancements to human physiology. They had been forcing humanity to become a container for something that refused containment. And whatever that essence was, it fought back with every fiber of its existence. Another file contained a report from a field team assigned to recover additional samples. The document described an unidentified biological mass discovered in a stasis crypt beneath a Terran fortress long since repurposed. The mass was ancient, possibly predating Old Night, and when exposed to analysis, emitted faint warp distortions detectable even through shielding. The report ended with a stark warning. Tech priests advised immediate destruction. The master countermanded. Sample integrated into Lumen 5 research. I felt the temperature in the room drop, though I knew it was only my perception tightening around the implications. The Emperor had overridden the Mechanicus' caution. He had insisted on using a sample that their instruments deemed dangerously unstable. Not because he was reckless, but because he was running out of time or options. A nearby lumen panel flickered. The cogitator dimmed momentarily, then reasserted its brightness. For an instant, I wondered if I had triggered some monitoring system. But no alarm sounded. The silence remained steady, as if the room itself were too fascinated by the revelations unfolding on the screen to interrupt. Ventured further into the data. One particularly damaged set of logs displayed physiological reports from the early test subjects, the ones that had been implanted with unrefined organ templates. The descriptions were harrowing. Rapid bone density expansion rupturing the skin, uncontrolled muscle hypertrophy tearing ligaments, bodies attempting to adapt to the alien essence by shedding or rewiring parts of themselves. Many of the subjects did not survive long enough to complete metamorphosis. Those who lived longer suffered neural derailment so severe that even sedation failed to halt the process. A single surviving quote from a Medicae officer was preserved through 3 layers of corruption. Their bodies are trying to obey 2 masters. One wants to preserve them. The other wants to remake them. Those words rang in my mind like a bell struck in a hollow chamber. The Space Marines we know today are champions of the Imperium, testaments to the Emperor's unyielding will. But the ancestors of their gene line, the primordial experiments buried deep beneath Terra's surface, were born into a conflict between human flesh and an inheritance they were never meant to carry. Whatever the Emperor discovered, whatever he bound into the earliest gene seed, it had intentions, or at least instincts of its own. Whether it came from something alien or some half-forgotten remnant of a species extinguished by the age of strife, or merely an artifact misinterpreted by terrified researchers. None of the records dared claim certainty. Only one truth emerged clearly: humanity was not alone in the creation of its greatest warriors. Something else participated unwillingly or unknowingly, and the price was paid in something else participate. Human lives consumed before they ever held a bolter or recited the oaths of service. I shut down the cogitator before its flickering lumens could draw unwanted attention. As I stepped back into the bright corridor, the pick panel seemed to watch me with their mythic expressions, each flawless astartes silently daring me to question the perfection they represented. But now the flawless surfaces felt brittle, like porcelain hiding fractures so deep they would never truly mend. The lie was no longer carved in stone alone. It lived in steel corridors, in recycled air, in the polished myths imperial citizens clung to. And beneath all that shine lay the truth I could no longer ignore. The Space Marines were not built from humanity's strength. They were born from humanity's desperation, and from something humanity was never meant to touch. The training grounds of the Proto-Marines were nothing like the monumental fortress monasteries that later generations would inherit. Those citadels, with their echoing halls and sanctified drill squares, came long after stability had been achieved, long after the broken years were scrubbed from memory. The earliest grounds were built in secrecy on a continent scarred by old wars, their walls reinforced not for defense but containment. The air there always tasted of promethium residue, metallic dust, and the strange sterile tang of failed sterility fields. Even before I walked the site in person, the recovered records had already painted it in shades of ruin. The facility was still sealed when I arrived under the escort of a silent custodian servitor whose vox grill rattled with every filtered breath. Its amber optics glowed faintly, casting a dull halo across the corridor walls where faded warning sigils curled like dead leaves. The locks disengaged with a grinding clang, and the doors withdrew just enough to allow passage, as though reluctant to expose the memories trapped inside. The first chamber was enormous, an arena where dozens of young aspirants once trained, fought, bled, and died under a regime of merciless optimization. The floor was cracked, divots left by impact drills and bone. Old stains clung stubbornly to the ceramite tiles. Even after centuries of abandonment, a faint musk lingered in the air, something between sweat and the metallic sting of fear. The picked feed still embedded in the walls flickered with intermittent static, occasionally catching a ghostly silhouette of movement from some corrupted memory fragment. One such flicker resolved for only a second into the shape of a youth collapsing mid-sprint, limbs locking into violent spasms, tendons snapping visibly before the feed glitched again. At first, I assumed this was an error, some malfunction of aging machine spirits. But the logs told the same story. These young warriors, barely more than children, carried organs that had not yet learned to coexist within them. Muscles expanded too quickly, overclocking their metabolic systems. Bones calcified in uneven spurts. Hearts struggled to beat in rhythm with the hybridized demands forced upon them. The Emperor's vision demanded strength beyond mortal capacity. But the template he pursued was still foreign, still fighting to reconcile itself with the fragile vessel of human flesh. One training overseer's report barely legible beneath layers of emergency annotations described a cohort reduced from 30 aspirants to 9 within a single month. Their deaths were not the result of battle simulation accidents or weapon mishandling. Their own bodies were killing them. Some aspirants grew stronger by the hour, only to collapse suddenly when their hearts failed to keep up. Others developed reflexes sharp enough to catch a blade mid-strike, but their neural pathways burned out soon after, leaving them catatonic or violently delirious. A few succumbed to uncontrollable rage that required armed containment teams to intervene. Walking deeper into the grounds, I found the remnants of one such containment cell. The door had been bent outward, its ceramide plating warped as though struck by something with impossible force. Inside, the walls were scored with gouges that sank inches into the metal. The cell felt suffocated by an echo of violence, as if the air itself still remembered the agony of the aspirant who had once been confined within. On the floor lay the rusted remains of restraint shackles designed to withstand astartes-level strength. They had been snapped as if made from wire. A half-functional pick-log projector sat in the corner. I hesitated before activating it, knowing full well that some truths are harder to witness than to imagine. When the feed sputtered to life, the image resolved into the figure of a proto-marine. Towering yet malformed, muscles bulging asymmetrically beneath taut skin. His breath came in rapid, ragged bursts, and his eyes too bright, too frantic darted around the cell as if searching for something unseen. The feed captured him gripping the restraints before tearing them apart in a burst of strength, so sudden it blurred the image. He roared, not with fury, but with a kind of desperate confusion, as though his own body were betraying him. Then the feed cut to static. The overseer's accompanying audio note, still intact, whispered, "It isn't hatred. It's pain. They are breaking under something we cannot control." I stepped away, pulse hammering in my ears. These youths had been promised ascension. They had been told they were chosen to become the Emperor's first angels. Instead, they were sacrifices, bodies reshaped by an untested template that treated human physiology as clay to be sculpted, reformed, discarded. Their suffering was not just physical. Logs described aspirants waking with fragmented memories, unable to recall their own names, sometimes speaking in dialects unknown to any Terran scholars. One Medicae theorized these linguistic anomalies were side effects of neural graft overstimulation. Another report hinted far more cautiously that the donor essence itself might have carried faint echoes of an origin no one dared to find out. As I moved out of the containment hall, the training grounds widened into an open plateau where recruits once underwent survival exercises. The terrain was a cruel mixture of jagged stone, ash dunes, and skeletal remains of bombed-out ruins, remnants of old night's devastation repurposed into yet another trial. The skeletal frames of obstacle structures still towered overhead, casting long shadows. The wind whipped through them with a mournful howl that sounded almost like voices. Here, the proto-marines had fought beasts, environmental hazards, and often their own failing bodies. The overseer logs from these trials were even more harrowing. Aspirants simply collapsing mid-task, their enhanced musculature devouring nutrients faster than their bodies could supply. Others tearing ligaments during leaps. They were strong enough to attempt, but not stable enough to land. Still others succumbing to seizures triggered by sudden changes in atmospheric pressure. One log captured the aftermath of a night exercise where half a cohort vanished in the dark. The pics recovered from their helm feeds showed eerie distortions, blurred figures, trailing after images, strange luminescent streaks in the air. The logs attributed these anomalies to organ failure combined with sensory overload, but the phrasing was cautious, as though the overseers themselves were unsure of what they had seen. The truth was emerging with terrible clarity. The Proto-Marines were not early successes conveniently overshadowed by the later triumph of the legions. They were casualties of a war between incompatible inheritances, humanity's fragile flesh, and something older, volatile, and entirely uninterested in preserving the lives it touched. And the Emperor, for reasons lost to time, had pressed forward despite every warning, every failure, every death. The children of this broken template were not failures. They were the foundation. The Imperium had buried them so deeply that even their ghosts were forced into silence. The deeper I ventured into the forgotten training grounds, the more the atmosphere tightened around me, pressing inward with the same suffocating weight I had felt in the gene forges. These ruins were quieter, though. Not merely abandoned, forsaken, as if the earth itself rejected what had happened here. Even the wind, restless across Terra's surface, seemed to avoid the open arena where countless Proto-Marines had fought for futures they would never live to see. The sky above was a pale smear through fractured lumin panels that still arched overhead, like a broken dome meant to simulate daylight. Their light flickered in irregular pulses, as though mimicking the dying heartbeats of those who once trained beneath them, crossed an expanse of cracked stone marked by deep gouges. At first glance, the marks resembled weapon impacts, but a closer look revealed something stranger: patterns of stress fractures, indicating brute force far beyond human capability, yet executed with chaotic, uncontrolled angles. The trainees had been strong enough to split stone, but not stable enough to harness their strength. It was power without balance, magnitude without mastery. And all around those fractured lines lay scraps of armor plating, early prototypes of the later power armor systems, thinner and more fragile. Some still bore the faint imprint of the Mechanicus cog, half melted by exposure to metabolic fluids far more corrosive than anything human bodies should have produced. A collapsed observation tower leaned precariously to one side. I climbed the unstable stairway, each step groaning under my weight, until I reached the platform that once served as an overseer's vantage point. From there, the entire ground stretched before me, a graveyard of ambition. Scanners embedded in the railings sparked when I touched them, projecting faint traces of archived telemetry. Heartbeat data spiked wildly across a single cohort, rising from disciplined rhythm into frantic surges moments before collapsing into flatlines. Another set of logs recorded environmental readings during one night trial, showing inexplicable shifts in temperature, localized around specific aspirants drops so sharp the Fae records classified them as field distortion phenomena. The Mechanicus had flagged these anomalies for deeper investigation, but the corresponding report was missing, replaced by a single line, reviewed and sealed by decree of the Master. My hands tightened around the railing. Whatever those distortions were, they hadn't been natural. They hinted at influences the training overseers were never told to expect, glimpses of an inheritance that neither they nor the aspirants could control. And still, the program had continued. Descending from the tower, I entered a narrow passageway leading to what appeared to be a barracks. The air inside was stale, heavy with a residue of too many lives extinguished before their time. Rows of bunk frames stood in rigid formation, each one holding scraps of medical bandages, shredded training garb, or the occasional carved token attempts by children forced into adulthood to cling to whatever humanity they had left. Some tokens depicted crude imperial aquilas, unevenly scratched into metal slivers with trembling hands. Others bore sigils unlike anything recorded in imperial catechisms, spirals, branching lines, shapes that seemed almost instinctually drawn rather than consciously designed. I traced one such symbol, feeling its grooves like the ghost of a forgotten thought. At the far end of the barracks lay a communal infirmary. The door was jammed partly open, warped by internal impact forces. Pushing through, I found rows of operating tables, each permanently stained by fluids no cleansing agent had ever fully erased. Surgical implements lay scattered across the surfaces, bone saws, injector arrays, modified nutrient pumps. Even in disuse, the equipment radiated the memory of urgency and despair. A pick slate lay abandoned atop one table. Miraculously intact, it activated the moment my fingers brushed its edge. The recording it contained was grainy, sound bleeding in and out like distant waves of static. A Medicae officer stood over a young aspirant whose skin had turned a mottled, unnatural color. The aspirant writhed as though two sets of instincts fought within him, one pulling his limbs toward a defensive curl, the other forcing them to extend in rigid, unnatural angles. The Medicae's voice trembled as he spoke. He's trying to regulate his own bone density. It's growing too fast for his muscles to keep pace. And the neural drift emperor save him, his mind is splitting between responses. He's hearing voices that aren't there, reacting to stimuli we can't detect. If we keep pushing them like this, they won't survive long enough to become anything. The aspirant suddenly convulsed, a violent spasm that snapped the restraints holding him down. The recording cut to distortion, but not before capturing the Medicae's final, broken whisper. This isn't a flaw in them. It's a flaw in the foundation. When the image faded, I found myself gripping the slate so hard my hand ached. These were not the failures of weak recruits. These were the consequences of a template forcing itself onto bodies too incompatible to bear it. The emperor had envisioned perfection, but he was not sculpting from pure clay. He was refining a hybrid and amalgamation of human resilience and something else that resisted being shaped. I stepped out of the infirmary, letting the stale air settle around me. As I walked back into the open arena, the flickering lumin panels cast elongated shadows across the ground, bending around the ruins of training machinery. For a moment, the shadows almost resembled figures aspirants running drills, collapsing, rising again, striving for futures they didn't know were stolen before they began. The children of a broken template had never been remembered, but the land remembered them. Every stone, every scar, every silence carried the echo of their struggle. And in that silence, the truth rang louder than any. They were not the Emperor's angels, they were his. Crucible, and they had burned for the sake of a perfection only achieved. After their bodies had fed the foundation, there are places within the Imperium where the past has been locked away not to preserve it, but to keep it from breathing. The vault I descended into next belonged to that category. It lay beneath an abandoned monastery once overseen by the Sigillite servants, built during the Great Crusade and sealed shortly after the Horus Heresy. Officially, it housed relics deemed irrelevant to ongoing governance, obsolete texts, disfavored doctrines, arcane philosophical essays the administratum no longer taught. That lie, like so many others, dissolved the moment I crossed the threshold. The air here felt old, as though every particle carried the memory of something that had been forced into silence. Dust floated like the remnants of ancient prayers. My footsteps echoed too sharply for such a small space, as if the vault had grown hollowed from within, expanded by absence. The lumen globes in the ceiling swayed gently, though there was no wind. Their glow illuminated shelves carved from black stone, each holding scrolls bound with wax seals, so brittle they cracked under the faintest touch. The inscriptions on the walls were written in High Gothic intertwined with symbols I couldn't immediately identify. Some resembled sigils used by the Mechanicus, others were stranger curved shapes and branching lines reminiscent of the carvings I had seen in the Proto-Marine barracks. They seemed to twist when viewed from different angles, hinting at forms that refused static interpretation. Even the light felt cautious around them, bending subtly as though unwilling to illuminate too deeply. Approached a central lectern where a single tome rested beneath a cracked stasis field. The device flickered uncertainly as I deactivated it, the ancient machinery groaning like a waking beast. The book beneath was bound in scaled leather, its surface cool and faintly iridescent. A text of this age should have been brittle, yet it felt unnervingly intact as though preserving itself. The opening page bore no title, only an ink depiction of a humanoid shape wreathed in halos of light and shadow. Not a saint, not a Primarch, something older. The passages within were written in a hand both elegant and frantic. They told of a traveler who crossed the stars long before the rise of Terra's early civilizations. A being described not as divine, nor monstrous, but wounded. Its essence was said to bleed into the void, leaving behind fragments that glowed with faint luminance even after ages of drifting through the dark. The language blurred frequently between metaphor and testimony. The author was perhaps trying to describe something beyond comprehension. At times, the creature seemed physical, its flesh torn by war. At others, it resembled an idea given form, something that could reshape matter simply by existing near it. Most importantly, the text claimed this traveler was dying, and that wherever its fragments fell, life took on strange, accelerated forms, plants growing with unnatural speed, creatures mutating violently or gaining impossible endurance, ecosystems shattering under the pressure of evolutionary leaps never meant to occur. Entire regions were transformed, then abandoned by whatever intelligence had observed them. A margin note, written in a different handwriting, corrected one phrase: not transformed, repurposed. I felt a cold spark race down my spine. Another section hinted that these fragments, when handled by those unprepared, induced visions, whispers of memories not their own, echoes of a sorrow so deep it warped perception. A traveler dying slowly, stretching itself thin across the galaxy, leaving behind pieces of its essence like broken wings. No known xenospecies matched this description. No imperial archive recorded such a being. Yet the author wrote with conviction, as if they had witnessed its aftermath. Firsthand, that the final pages described how a small remnant of this essence, stabilized only by stasis, had been recovered during one of the Emperor's earliest expeditions. Not the Great Crusade. Earlier, far earlier, before Terra had fully unified. The text did not claim the Emperor used it directly. It only presented a series of observations. The Master studied it for years. The Mechanicum feared it. The Sigillite warned it should be left to die. And yet the Master kept it, The author's final note had been written in a trembling hand. As though carved under duress, he seeks to build something from its final spark. But the spark does not wish to fade. It wishes to take form again. I stared at the words until the vault around me blurred. This was not proof, only rumor, a scrap of ancient testimony preserved by accident or intent. And yet it aligned too well with what I had uncovered. The instability of the earliest gene seed. The unnatural distortions in the training grounds. The desperate attempts to force the implant organs to align with human physiology. The whispers of donor essence in Mechanicus reports. The Emperor, in his unfathomable wisdom, had taken something broken, powerful, and dying, and bent it toward his vision. Whether out of necessity, brilliance, or desperation, no record dared specify. But the ambiguity in these texts did not weaken the implication. If the earliest gene seed carried even a fraction of this spark, then the proto-marines had not only inherited human potential, they had inherited the echoes of something far older, something wounded enough to lash out even in fragments. I closed the tome carefully and looked around the vault. For the first time since beginning this journey, the silence did not feel empty. It felt watchful. Something had been borrowed. Something had been bound. And the Imperium had spent 10,000 years praying no one would ever learn the nature of the spark that made its angels possible. I carried the weight of that vault's revelations with me as I climbed a narrow spiral stairway that wound deeper into the monasteries. Understructure, a path marked on no official schematics but hinted at in the margin notes of that trembling manuscript. The air cooled rapidly, thinning as if the passages themselves exhaled a memory too cold for the lungs of ordinary men. The stone underfoot grew darker, smoother, worn by hands and feet that must have once walked this hidden path with purpose and dread. Sounds that should have echoed footsteps, breath. Fabric brushing stone seemed instead to be absorbed by the walls, swallowed whole as if even noise feared disturbing what lay ahead. The stairway ended in a chamber far smaller than the vault above, its architecture stark and utilitarian. No inscriptions decorated the walls. No devotional symbols watched from the corners. This was not a place of reverence or study. It was a place of containment. A single lumen globe hovered weakly overhead, its glow shivering across the floor as though it resented the burden of illuminating what remained here. In the center of the room stood a stasis capsule, not of Mechanicus design, but far older. The casing was wrought from an alloy that shimmered faintly in the dim light, shifting between metallic hues in a way that defied stability. The surface looked almost organic, as though it grew rather than was forged. Thin filaments ran across its length like veins, pulsing intermittently with a faint luminescent rhythm. The Mechanicus archives had nothing like this. Even their most sacred vaults of lost technology from the dark age of technology contained nothing with such alien elegance. And the capsule's presence here, hidden beneath a monastery older than the legions, made my skin prickle with creeping realization. A small control lectern jutted from the floor near its base, wrapped in dust. Someone had attempted to wipe the panel long ago, leaving streak marks like the trace of fading urgency. I brushed away the remaining dust. The interface flickered uncertainly before stabilizing, revealing a single line of text coded in archaic High Gothic. Essentia fragmentum final stasis integrity, deteriorating. Beneath it, another line older still displayed a warning, do not awaken. Do not disturb. Do not remember. My pulse quickened. I didn't dare touch the activation sigils, but even proximity seemed enough for the capsule to sense my presence. The filament veins brightened fractionally, pulsing with a rhythm too slow to match a heartbeat, too uneven to mimic machinery. For a moment, I felt warmth blooming near the capsule's surface, not physical warmth, but something eerily familiar, as though a distant memory that wasn't mine brushed the edge of consciousness. Images flickered through my mind in flashes, too fast to grasp. Vast starscapes torn open by burning wounds of warp light. A colossal silhouette drifting through the void, trailing brilliance and decay. A sensation of searching, not with eyes, but with longing. Then, just as quickly, the impressions were gone, leaving behind a hollow ache. I staggered back, catching myself on the cold stone wall. The air in the chamber seemed to ripple faintly, settling only after I took several steadying breaths. The capsule dimmed again, its luminescent veins retreating into their shallow pulse as though satisfied or exhausted. Whatever rested inside that stasis vessel was not conscious, not in any human sense, but some remnant of awareness lingered. A resonance, an instinct, and even weakened, even fragmented, it was powerful enough to bleed impressions into an unprotected mind. The Mechanicus had called the donor essence unstable. The manuscripts hinted at a traveler wounded beyond comprehension. But feeling even that faint echo revealed something far more unsettling. The essence had not been inert when the Emperor found it. It had been alive. Dying, perhaps, but alive. And he had taken it, not out of cruelty, not out of malice, but out of need. The Great Crusade, the unification of Terra, the rise of the Primarchs, these monumental triumphs demanded foundations that could not wait for a perfect solution. Humanity was cornered by a galaxy that had already begun sharpening its teeth. And so the Emperor had reached into the dark and taken the one spark capable of igniting his vision. But sparks burned. They consumed. And the Proto-Marines had been the first to feel the flame. Found another inscription carved discreetly into the chamber wall, hidden beneath centuries of dust. Unlike the stern warnings on the panel, this line was carved and shaky. Uneven strokes as though made by someone who did not want the words to be found, yet could not bear letting them vanish completely. We begged him to let it die. He refused. For if it died, so would we all. The words trembled in my mind long after I left the chamber, climbing back toward the monastery's upper floors. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of a truth too immense to contain. The Imperium had not merely hidden these origins out of shame or doctrinal purity. It had hidden them because understanding the borrowed spark at the heart of the Astartes meant confronting the truth of humanity's dependence not on its own strength, but on something alien, ancient, and unwilling, and that truth threatened the very myth that kept the Imperium alive. The spark was borrowed. The spark was bound. And even after 10,000 years, its echo still lingered, pulsing in the shadows like a heartbeat that refused to die by the time I returned to Terra's surface. The world no longer looked the way it had when I first walked beneath the statue of that flawless stone warrior. The sky was the same pale smear beneath the planetary defense grid. The administratum towers still clawed upward like serried blades. The endless tide of humanity still surged through the hab spires and transit hubs with the same exhausted determination. But I had descended too far into the Imperium's buried arteries to ever see these things as mere scenery again. Every tower felt built atop bones. Every hymn sounded like a wall being reinforced around a truth no one wanted spoken aloud. I made my way back to the central archive. That cathedral of sanctioned knowledge where the monument still reigned above its flock of obedient records. The statue's eyes were just as lifeless as before, but now I could feel the light radiating from every chisel mark. The inscription at its base proclaimed the Space Marines as the Emperor's pure and untainted gift to humanity, wrought from his genius alone. The words rang hollow. Not because the Astartes weren't magnificent, not because their deeds weren't real, but because their story had been carved down into something simple enough for frightened minds to hold. The archivist watched me approach with an expression somewhere between politeness and concern. Perhaps she sensed the change in my gaze, the way I no longer moved like a harmless researcher content with footnotes and citations. I requested access to materials far beyond the scope of my original assignment, inquisitorial commentaries on doctrinal edits, Sigillate-era memos, Mechanicus dispute logs regarding the ownership of certain bioartifacts. She hesitated only once. When I spoke the phrase Operation Lumen 5 aloud, the air between us seemed to thicken. "I don't know where you heard that designation," she said quietly, "but if you value your life, you will forget it." "I've seen what came before the legions," I replied, my voice less steady than I wished. "And I've read accounts from beneath the monasteries. You sealed the failures. You buried the donor essence. You turned the children of a broken template into ghosts. But you can't pretend there was no price." Her composure fractured just for a heartbeat. Then she did something I did not expect. Instead of summoning enforcers or activating alarms, she led me away from the central hall, down a narrow service corridor that smelled of old wiring and litanies smoked into the walls. We stopped before a simple door marked only with an administratum sigil. No inquisitorial rosette. No mechanicum cog. Just a number dot. Inside was a room barely larger than a storage closet. A single desk. A single lumen. A single data terminal whose casing bore the faint scars of multiple reassignment seals. The archivist keyed in a sequence so old the panel responded with a groan, as though reacting to a command it had hoped never to hear again. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of documents under a shared header, on the matter of origins. The sigils attached to the files were eclectic administratum, Mechanicus, Astra Telepathica, and on one particularly corrupted entry, the faint outline of the Sigillite's own personal mark. "These are not for you," the archivist said softly. "They are not meant for anyone. But you've already stepped too far to be saved by ignorance. Read, then, and understand why we forget." The first file was a transcript from a council held during the early years of the Great Crusade. The names were redacted, but the roles were clear. A Mechanicus Magos, a senior Imperial Strategos, a representative of the Astra Telepathica, and a figure whose words were transcribed only as the Regent's voice, likely one of the Sigillite's agents. They debated the nature of the Astartes and the ethics of their creation, though the word ethics appeared only once, quickly buried beneath more practical concerns. The Magos argued that continued integration of the donor essence posed unacceptable long-term risks. Its influence, though diminished by the Emperor's modifications, still manifested in unpredictable ways, subtle distortions in perception, occasional anomalies in battlefield telemetry, rare but troubling instances of astartes exhibiting brief episodes of dislocation, as if reality had shifted a fraction of a breath around them. The telepathica representative insisted they had detected faint, ghost-like impressions in the warp around certain gene lines, flickers of something neither demonic nor fully human. Their conclusion was stark. The essence, however refined, still remembered being something else. The strategos countered with cold numbers, worlds reclaimed, Xeno's empires shattered, rebellions crushed by the unstoppable momentum of the legions. Whatever discomfort the gene-line origins provoked, the results could not be denied. Humanity was winning. The cost, he implied, was irrelevant compared to the alternative. Then the regent's voice spoke. We stand at a crossroads between survival and purity. The master has chosen survival. Our duty is not to revisit that choice. Our duty is to ensure its consequences do not fracture the Imperium from within. There was a pause in the transcript, a gap where the scribes had either failed to capture the exchange or deliberately cut it. When the recording resumed, the decision had already been made. All records referencing the donor essence would be sealed. The Mechanicus would be forbidden from pursuing independent study. The telepathica would classify any metaphysical anomalies as battlefield superstition unless clearly demonic. The proto-marine failures would be erased from official history, and the astartes would be presented to the galaxy as pure children of humanity's genius. No mention of the wounded traveler, no hint of the borrowed spark. The next document was less formal. A private reflection written by an unknown functionary, never meant for public eyes. The script was hesitant, the tone almost apologetic. We have chosen to forget. Not because the truth is false, but because it is too heavy for the structures we have built. The Imperium needs simple certainties. It cannot bear the knowledge that its guardians carry within them the echoes of something we did not create, something we broke and repurposed. The Master has done what he deemed necessary. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps this is the only path that allows humanity to endure. But I cannot help feeling that every monument we raise to the Astartes is also a gravestone for the truth. As I read, the archivist watched me with a mixture of pity and caution. Do you see now? She asked. The Imperium does not refuse to discuss the origin of the Astartes because it is ashamed of their power. It refuses because it is terrified of what that power says about us. I looked at the plain terminal, the unadorned walls, the absence of iconography. This was the room where a civilization had decided to forget its own bargain, and in that moment, I understood that the story I was chasing had no clean answers, no righteous revelation that would topple statues and rewrite catechisms overnight. It wasn't a secret weapon or a heretical manifesto. It was something far more fragile and dangerous. It was context. It was doubt. It was the knowledge that humanity's greatest defenders were born not from unblemished genius, but from desperation, compromise, and a spark that had once belonged to something else. I stayed in that small, unmarked room far longer than I intended, letting the archivist's words settle like dust over unquiet bones. The terminal's glow cast thin lines of light across her face, revealing exhaustion carved so deeply it seemed older than she was. Perhaps she too had descended into Forbidden's vaults. Perhaps she had once believed in clean histories and unbroken genius before discovering the fractures beneath the marble. Or perhaps she had inherited the burden from someone who came before her, passing it down like an heirloom no one wanted but no one dared destroy. The next file opened without prompting, as though the system recognized I was past the point of turning back. This record was different, fragmented, its metadata corrupted, missing context and authorship. Only one line of intact header remained: observed anomalies in fully stabilized Astartes cohorts. What followed were brief notes compiled over decades. Small irregularities in sensory perception during certain campaigns. Rare instances where an Astartes reported a momentary doubling of vision not linked to helm malfunction. Faint afterimages captured by Auspex recordings, dismissed by commanders as environmental interference. Nothing dramatic. Nothing overt. But together the anomalies formed a pattern, one that aligned uneasily with the dying echoes of the traveler's essence. One entry described a veteran of the 13th Legion who, after a brutal siege, stood motionless on a parapet for nearly an hour. Helm removed, eyes unfocused. When questioned, he reported feeling something like a shadow of memory passing through me. A second entry detailed an Astartes of the Blood Angels freezing mid-charge as if struck by invisible pressure. His brothers saw nothing, but his vitals spiked into dangerous territory. Moments later, he continued fighting, never speaking of the incident again. A later annotation, added during the era of the Scouring, warned that such anomalies were increasing in rare, unpredictable intervals. The scribe offered no explanation, only a caution: the spark persists. Fragmentary, harmless, yet persistent. The archivist whispered, almost absently, "Even now, the essence lingers." Diminished by the Emperor's will, shaped by millennia of refinement, but not entirely extinguished. The Marines do not know. They feel it only as instinct, drive, the sense of purpose they claim flows from the Master's design. Perhaps it does. Or perhaps it is something older, harnessed and repurposed, echoing through them like a distant heartbeat. The room felt smaller then, as though its walls leaned inward to listen. I opened the final document, a personal letter never sent. Its edges burned, preserved only because it had been mistakenly archived with official memos. The handwriting was deliberate but trembling, as though the author struggled between duty and conscience. We do not tell them. Not the legions, not the lords of Terra, not even the custodians who stand at his side. They believe their origins are divine, pure, crafted solely from the Emperor's own brilliance. And perhaps that is the truth they require. For how would they shoulder their burdens if they knew they were born partly from a dying stranger's remnants? How would they reconcile their purpose if they realized their existence is not a miracle of human perfection, but a triumph built atop compromises and borrowed strength? A second paragraph, half obscured. The Master did what he had to. He made a choice no one else could bear. And yet I wonder, when he looks upon his sons, does he feel pride or apology? The letter ended abruptly, ink trailing into a dark stain, as though the writer had been interrupted or had lost the courage to continue. Closed the terminal and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The archivist extinguished the lumen with a single gesture, plunging the room into a softer, more forgiving darkness. Only her voice remained. You see now why the Imperium cannot remember. The Astartes must remain symbols, unquestionable, untouchable. If the people knew they were shaped partly from a dying alien spark, they would fear them. If the Astartes knew, they might doubt themselves. And if the truth spread far enough, the entire foundation of imperial faith could crack. But isn't a truth buried alive more dangerous than a truth spoken? I asked. The archivist shook her head slowly. Truth is not dangerous. Its implications are, humanity survives on certainty, not accuracy. If the truth cannot strengthen the Imperium, it must be forgotten. Her words lingered like smoke long after she left me alone with the darkness. I stepped back into the archive hall, where the statue still towered above everything, unblemished, triumphant, perfect. A lie carved in stone, yet a necessary one. According to those who had shaped this version of history, but walking beneath its shadow, I no longer saw perfection. I saw a monument to silence, a gravestone for the children who died unnamed in the forges, a memorial for the spark that had burned itself into extinction so humanity could live, a symbol of the Emperor's greatest act of creation and his greatest burden. I looked up at the sculpted face, serene and resolute, and felt the weight of everything I had learned pressed down like the vaults themselves. The Imperium would never speak of this origin. It would erase every fragment, silence every witness, and bury every deviation from the myth. But myths do not erase truth. They only outlive it. And in the quiet between my breaths, I found myself whispering into the void of the hall. They were not born perfect. They were born necessary. Outside, the bells of Terra rang in distant harmony, their echoes sweeping through the streets like a reminder that life continued, oblivious to the sacrifices built beneath its foundations. Storm clouds gathered across the upper atmospherics, casting long shadows over the hive spires, shadows that stretched like the memory of the travelers dying. Light. Humanity did not rise alone. Humanity rose because something ancient fell, and the Imperium will spend the rest of its existence refusing to remember it.